When Moses, the servant of the Lord, passed from this world and the mourning of Israel faded from the plains of Moab, a profound stillness settled across the camp. More than a leader had died, an era had ended. The man who stood before Pharaoh, who stretched out his staff over the sea, who ascended the mountain wrapped in cloud and fire, who interceded again and again for a stubborn nation, was gone. Israel had known no other guide, no other voice that spoke with God face to face. And now the people, standing on the threshold of the land promised for centuries, waited with a mixture of grief, uncertainty, and trembling anticipation. In that moment of transition, God spoke, not in thunder, not on a shaking mountain, but in a clear, commanding voice to the one he had chosen long before, Joshua son of Nun. Joshua had never sought greatness. He was not a man who coveted attention or authority. He had been Moses' assistant since youth, fetching, serving, waiting, listening. While others boasted or complained, Joshua quietly absorbed every lesson. He was the young warrior who stood beside Moses during the battle with Amalek while Aaron and Hur held up the prophet's arms. He was one of the 12 spies who searched the promised land, and one of only 2 who returned with faith instead of fear. When the rest of Israel trembled before giants, Joshua declared, "The Lord is with us." Because of this faith, Joshua remained under God's favor even as the entire generation around him fell in the wilderness. Now, with the promised land finally within reach, God called Joshua to step into the role Moses had carried, leader, shepherd, and commander of God's people. The voice of the Lord came to Joshua with a clarity that pierced through every doubt. "Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them." These words carried both weight and wonder. God was not merely instructing Joshua to continue Moses' work, he was beginning something new. The promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now ready to unfold. The wandering was over. The era of conquest had begun. Yet God did not leave Joshua with only a mission, he gave him a promise: "I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you." These words, echoing like a heartbeat through Joshua's soul, became the foundation on which every battle would be fought. God commanded Joshua to be strong and courageous, not once, but repeatedly, as though chiseling the words into his spirit. Strength alone would not be enough, courage alone would not sustain him. But the strength that comes from obedience and the courage that comes from God's presence would carry him through rivers, walls, and armies. "Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses commanded you," God said. "Do not turn from it to the right or to the left." Joshua learned that success in the promised land depended not on military power, clever strategy, or sheer numbers, but on unwavering obedience to God's word. The book of the law was to remain on his lips and in his thoughts day and night. Victory would flow not from swords but from submission to God. With God's commission burning in his heart, Joshua stood before the people. His voice was steady, anchored by divine assurance. "Prepare your provisions," he announced. "In 3 days you will cross the Jordan." The camp stirred with energy. For 40 years they had wandered, and now the promise was no longer distant, it was days away. Joshua sent messengers through the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, reminding them of their oath to fight alongside their brothers until the land was secured. Their response came with bold loyalty: "All that you command us we will do. Only may the Lord your God be with you." Joshua felt the weight of leadership settle upon him, not as a burden but as a calling shaped by God. Yet even with God's promises, Joshua understood the gravity of the task before him. The Jordan River, swollen with spring currents, stood between Israel and their inheritance. Beyond it lay fortified cities, seasoned warriors, and nations that would not yield their land easily. Joshua was a soldier, and he knew battles were not won by emotion alone. God's promise gave confidence, but confidence demanded preparation. Before Israel moved as a nation, Joshua acted as a strategist. He quietly chose 2 men, skilled, disciplined, and faithful, and sent them as spies into Jericho. "Go, look over the land," he said. These spies, unlike those from 40 years prior, carried not fear but conviction. Their mission would become the first piece in God's unfolding plan of conquest. As the spies traveled toward Jericho, Joshua remained in the camp, watching the river that would soon part under God's might. The rising sun shimmered on the waters, and the distant hills cast long shadows across the plains. Joshua knew that the land beyond the river was beautiful, rich, and filled with promise, but also filled with danger. Still, the words of God sustained him. "Every place the sole of your foot treads, I have given you." In those words Joshua found confidence, knowing that the ground Israel would claim already belonged to them by divine decree. The coming battles would reveal God's power, not human strength. As the spies' journey unfolded, God was preparing Jericho for Israel's arrival. Rahab, a woman with a stained past but an open heart, sheltered the spies and risked her life to align herself with the God of Israel. Her faith echoed across Jericho's walls and reached Joshua as the spies returned. "The Lord has surely given the land into our hands," they told him. "All the people are melting in fear because of us." These words confirmed everything God had spoken. The land was ripe. The people were terrified. God had gone ahead of Israel. Joshua felt courage swell within him, not pride, but confident obedience. With preparation complete and encouragement received, Joshua approached the people once more. His voice carried the steady authority of a man who had met with God. "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." The camp fell into solemn preparation. Families washed their garments. Priests prepared the ark. Parents told children stories of the Red Sea, reminding them that the God who parted waters before would do so again. Anticipation rippled through the nation. It was not only a crossing that awaited them, it was a covenant moment, a divine appointment, a transition from wandering to inheritance. Joshua also met privately with the priests, giving them a command that required absolute trust. "When you reach the water's edge, stand in the Jordan." These words defied logic. The river was at flood stage, roaring with power. But Joshua knew obedience demanded stepping into danger before the miracle came. God had said he would exalt Joshua before all Israel so that the people would know he was with him as he had been with Moses. The priest's obedience would become the sign of Joshua's divine appointment. Night settled over the camp, and a holy hush covered the valley. Joshua, alone with the Lord, contemplated the task ahead. He felt no fear, only reverence. The legacy of Moses still echoed around him, but Joshua was not called to imitate Moses. He was called to follow God. And God had spoken. That was enough. The dawn of a new era approached, and with it, the fulfillment of promises spanning centuries. Israel stood ready. Joshua stood appointed. God stood with them. When Joshua sent the 2 chosen men secretly into the land, his instructions were simple but carried immense weight. They were to observe Jericho, discern the strength of its walls, the spirit of its people, and the vulnerabilities within the city that guarded the entrance to the promised land. These spies slipped away from the Israelite camp under the cover of fading daylight, crossing the Jordan in silence, moving with the caution of men who understood that the smallest misstep could cost them their lives and compromise God's unfolding plan. The land they entered was foreign yet promised, a land both beautiful and dangerous, its streets filled with strangers who would see them not as wanderers but as enemies. As they neared Jericho, towering walls rose before them, thick, imposing, built to intimidate and defend. Torches flickered along the battlements, casting long shadows that danced across the ancient stone. Jericho was no ordinary settlement, it was a fortress, the gateway to Canaan, the first obstacle Israel would face. And behind those walls lived men trained for war, ready to strike down any who threatened their domain. The spies walked through the outer marketplace blending with travelers and traders, their cloaks pulled low and their steps deliberate. They avoided the guards stationed at the gates and settled into the lower district, where noise and movement provided cover. It was here they found shelter in the house of Rahab, a woman whose reputation allowed strangers to enter without drawing suspicion. Though her occupation was scorned by many, God had chosen her heart long before she chose to help His people. Something within Rahab recognized that these men were different, that they carried not only secrets but the presence of a God whose name had begun to shake the nations. Word had spread throughout Canaan, whispers of a sea parted by divine power, of kings defeated in the wilderness, of a people protected by a cloud and fire. Jericho's bravest warriors trembled at these stories, and Rahab herself, though her life was tethered to the brokenness of her past, felt drawn to the God who performed such wonders. But Jericho was not blind. Before the spies had even settled in Rahab's home, rumors began circulating. Foreigners had entered the city. They were seen moving with caution, observing too much, asking too many questions. The king of Jericho was informed, and his suspicion tightened like a snare. Soldiers were dispatched immediately, marching through the streets with urgency, their armor clattering under torchlight. They stopped at Rahab's door, banging heavily, their voices stern and threatening. "Bring out the men who came to you, for they have come to spy out the land." Rahab stood at the doorway with her heart pounding, aware that her decision in the next few moments would determine her fate. She had already hidden the spies beneath stalks of drying flax on her rooftop, covering them with silence and courage. Her voice did not tremble as she spoke to the soldiers. "The men came to me, yes, but I did not know where they were from. When the city gate was about to close at dusk, they left. I do not know where they went. Pursue them quickly, you may catch them." The soldiers, eager to be the ones who captured the spies, took off running toward the Jordan road, never suspecting the truth. The spies were only a few steps above them, hidden under harvest bundles. When the footsteps faded, Rahab climbed to the rooftop. The spies emerged from beneath the flax, their faces marked by tension and disbelief. Why would a woman risk everything for them? Rahab's eyes reflected both desperation and deep conviction. "I know that the Lord has given you this land," she confessed. "A great fear has fallen on us. Our people tremble because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you. We know how you defeated Sion and Og. Your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." Her words struck the spies with awe. Here, in the heart of enemy territory, faith bloomed in the most unlikely place. Rahab continued, her voice softening, "Now swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all who belong to them. Deliver us from death." The spies exchanged a solemn glance. They saw the sincerity of her plea, the courage in her actions, the stirrings of a faith that would one day echo through generations. "Our lives for your lives," they promised. "But you must not betray us. When the Lord gives us the land, we will show kindness and faithfulness to you." Rahab led them to the window that faced the outer wall. A scarlet cord was tied at the base, soon to become a symbol of salvation and covenant. She lowered the spies down into the night, instructing them to hide in the hills for 3 days until the soldiers chasing them returned empty-handed. "When you come for the city," she said, "leave this cord in the window. My family will be inside." The spies nodded, feeling the weight of her trust. With careful steps they descended the wall, disappearing into the wilderness as Rahab closed her window and prayed silently to a God she had only heard about but had already chosen to serve. The spies hid in the rugged hills, watching from afar as Jericho's soldiers searched the riverbanks, scanning every shadow and thicket. Days passed, and the search party returned defeated. When the way was clear, the spies crossed the Jordan and hurried back to the Israelite camp. Joshua waited them, his expression firm but hopeful. When they delivered their report, the words filled Joshua's spirit with strength, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting with fear because of us." This was not merely military intelligence, it was confirmation of God's promise. Jericho was fortified, but its heart was already defeated. The faith of one woman had revealed the fear of an entire nation. Joshua lifted his eyes toward the Jordan River, its waters still swelling with spring currents. The time had come. The spies' mission was complete. Faith had taken root in the land they were destined to inherit. And now Israel would rise, step into the waters, and begin the conquest that God Himself had ordained. The morning of the crossing dawned with an air of anticipation unlike anything Israel had experienced since the days of Moses. The sun rose slowly over the plains, casting warm light across thousands of tents that trembled gently in the early breeze. Families stood outside their shelters in silent wonder, children gripping their parents' hands, elders lifting their eyes toward the distant shimmer of the Jordan River. For 40 years they had wandered the wilderness, and every sunrise had carried the same question, "When, Lord?" Now the answer lay before them in the rushing waters that marked the border of the promised land. The Jordan River was swollen with spring rains, its currents fierce and violent, crashing against rocks and swirling in unpredictable torrents. To attempt a crossing at this time of year was madness by human measure, but this moment was not crafted by human plans, it was orchestrated by God Himself. Joshua, strengthened by God's command and the confidence of the people, walked steadily through the camp as the priests prepared to carry the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark, the sacred symbol of God's presence, was not a mere artifact, it was the throne of the invisible King, the sign that God walked among His people. As the priests lifted it onto their shoulders, an awe-filled hush spread through the camp like a holy wave. Joshua addressed the people with calm authority, his voice steady, "Come near and hear the words of the Lord your God. Today you will know that the living God is among you and that he will drive out the nations before you." His words washed over them like a promise carved in stone. Joshua continued, "When the priests who carry the ark place their feet in the Jordan's waters, the river will stop flowing." The people stared in disbelief, wondering how such a thing could be, yet remembering the stories their parents had told, the Red Sea parting, the miracles in the wilderness, the faithfulness of God that had never failed. The priests stepped forward, their eyes fixed not on the raging river but on the ark they carried. Each step brought them closer to the water's edge. The sound of the rushing currents grew louder, echoing like the roar of an approaching storm. Some among the crowd held their breath, others whispered prayers. When the priests' feet touched the brink of the water, nothing happened immediately. The current surged around their ankles, cold and relentless. But they did not step back. They moved forward in obedience, trusting the God who had promised to act. Then, without warning, the river responded, not gradually, not subtly, but with a sudden, divine interruption. Upstream, far beyond their sight, the waters halted, rising into a towering heap as though held back by an invisible hand. Downstream, the currents drained away until the riverbed near Jericho lay dry and exposed. The impossible had become reality. A gasp rippled through the people. Mothers lifted their children to see. Warriors stared in astonishment. Elders wept openly, remembering how God had parted the sea for their fathers and was now repeating the miracle for their children. The priests, carrying the ark, stepped confidently into the riverbed, the mud beneath their feet firming into solid ground the moment they touched it. They moved toward the center of the river and stood still, holding the ark in unwavering obedience. Their presence in the midst of the Jordan formed a living testimony that God was with them. As long as the ark remained in the riverbed, the waters would not return. Joshua raised his voice again, commanding the tribal leaders to choose 12 men, one from each tribe. God had instructed Joshua that these 12 would take 12 stones from the riverbed, stones that had been buried beneath the waters for generations. These stones would serve as a sign for future generations, a memorial so that when children asked, "What do these stones mean?" parents would tell them of the day God parted the Jordan River. The 12 men moved quickly, lifted heavy stones onto their shoulders, and carried them toward the western bank where Israel would encamp that night. Joshua himself walked into the river and built a second memorial, 12 stones placed at the exact spot where the priests stood. Those stones, submerged once the waters returned, would remain hidden beneath the Jordan forever, a silent witness to God's power. Meanwhile, the entire nation began to cross. Hundreds of thousands of people, families, livestock, warriors, elders, walked across the dry riverbed with wide eyes and pounding hearts. Children ran ahead, laughing as they touched the ground where water should have been. Soldiers marched with renewed courage. Parents whispered prayers of gratitude. Some knelt mid-crossing, lifting handfuls of dust and letting it fall through their fingers as they realized they were walking in a miracle. For the first time in their lives, they felt the reality of God's promise under their feet. On the other side of the river, the land of Canaan stretched before them, green, fertile, and filled with promise. Yet its cities and armies also awaited. Israel knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they also knew that the God who held back the river would go before them into every battle. When the last man had crossed, Joshua commanded the priests to come up out of the Jordan. The priests stepped out of the riverbed, their sandals touching the dry ground of Canaan. As soon as their feet left the river, the waters surged back into place with thunderous force, returning to their course as though nothing had happened. The river roared once more, but Israel stood safely on the other side. At Joshua's command, the 12 stones were arranged at a site called Gilgal, forming a circle of remembrance. Joshua addressed the people with solemn passion. In the future, when your children ask, "What do these stones mean?" you shall tell them, "Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord stopped the waters before the ark of his covenant." The stones stood as a permanent declaration that God keeps his promises, not just for one generation, but for all who trust him. And as the camp settled that night, a new chapter of Israel's journey began. They were no longer wanderers. They were heirs standing in their inheritance. Joshua gazed toward Jericho, its walls silent and watchful in the distance. The river now flowed behind Israel, cutting off any retreat. Ahead lay battles, miracles, and victories crafted by the hand of God. But for this moment, as the stars glittered over the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel rested in the truth that the God who had brought them across the Jordan would lead them every step that followed. When the people of Israel finished crossing the Jordan and settled at Gilgal, a calm yet holy weight rested upon the camp. They stood on the soil of the promised land at last, but before they could advance toward Jericho or lift a single weapon, God required something far deeper than military readiness. The first steps into Canaan were not footsteps of conquest, they were footsteps of consecration. God had brought his people across the river, but now he would bring their hearts into alignment with his covenant once more. For although they were physically in the promised land, spiritually they needed renewal, for a new generation had arisen in the wilderness that had not fully embraced the covenant of their fathers. Gilgal became not only a campsite but a spiritual threshold, a place where God would restore what wandering had delayed. Joshua stood before the Lord, and God spoke with clarity, "Make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel again." This command carried profound significance. The generation that came out of Egypt had practiced circumcision, but those born during the 40 years of wandering had not. Out of disobedience, rebellion, and divine discipline, they had lived unmarked by the covenant sign that separated Israel from the nations. The journey through the wilderness had purified them, but now the covenant had to be renewed. Joshua understood the magnitude of this command. Circumcision on the doorstep of enemy territory was an act of extreme vulnerability. No army would willingly weaken itself before battle. Yet this vulnerability was itself a declaration. Israel's trust rested not in swords or strength but in the Lord who fought for them. Joshua obeyed immediately. Flint knives were crafted, and the men of Israel gathered. The ritual was painful, physically and symbolically. It cut away not just flesh but the remnants of wilderness disobedience, marking each man as belonging to God alone. As the ceremony unfolded, a sacred stillness covered the camp. Israel lay vulnerable, but no enemy attacked. God himself guarded his people. Days passed as the men recovered, resting in the warmth of Canaan's sun and reflecting on the gravity of their renewed identity. They were no longer wanderers shaped by the failures of the past. They were covenant bearers, warriors of promise, children of Abraham stepping into destiny. When the healing was complete, God spoke again with a declaration that resonated through the camp like a trumpet blast. "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." The shame of slavery, the rebellion in the wilderness, the identity shaped by bondage, all of it was removed. Gilgal, meaning rolling away, became the symbol of Israel's restored standing before God. The people felt lighter, freer, as though the weight of generations had been lifted. For the first time in their lives, they knew what it meant to belong fully to the Lord without the shadows of Egypt clinging to their identity. The covenant renewed, Israel prepared for the feast of Passover. This celebration had marked their deliverance from Egypt, but now, for the first time, they observed it in the land God had promised. As twilight fell, fires burned across the camp, and the people remembered the night death passed over their homes, and God led them out of bondage. Fathers retold the story to wide-eyed children who had known only manna and desert sands. Mothers prepared the sacred meal, their hands steady with reverence. The Israelites ate the Passover with hearts full of gratitude, knowing that they were living the fulfillment of promises whispered to Abraham centuries before. The smell of roasted lamb, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread filled the air, becoming the fragrance of remembrance and hope. The next morning, something extraordinary happened, something that signaled a new chapter for Israel. The manna, the miraculous bread that had sustained them for 40 years, ceased. It did not taper or fade, it stopped instantly, as if God had closed a chapter with deliberate finality. In its place, Israel ate the produce of the land, grain, vegetables, fruits, the rich abundance of Canaan. The people tasted food grown in soil promised to their ancestors, and each bite reminded them that they were no longer dependent on the wilderness provisions but blessed with the harvest of their inheritance. The end of manna was not a loss, it was a declaration that Israel had arrived. With the covenant renewed and the feasts observed, Joshua walked alone near Gilgal, contemplating the next steps. Jericho loomed ahead, its walls visible in the distance, tall, imposing, seemingly impenetrable. Every instinct of a seasoned warrior told Joshua to strategize, to observe weaknesses, to prepare his forces. But Joshua knew that victory did not begin with plans, it began with seeking God. As he approached the outskirts of the camp, the air thickened with an unfamiliar presence. There, standing with authority and brilliance unlike anything Joshua had ever seen, was a man with a drawn sword. The figure radiated power, not the kind that threatened but the kind that commanded reverence. Joshua approached carefully, his warrior instincts alive. "Are you for us or for our enemies?" he asked. The figure replied with a voice that seemed to shake the ground beneath them, "Neither. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy." Joshua fell to the ground in worship, realizing he stood before a divine messenger. Some believe an angelic captain, others the very manifestation of the Lord himself. Whatever the identity, one truth became undeniable: Joshua was not the commander of Israel's destiny, God was. On that holy ground, Joshua's fears dissolved, and his strength was renewed. The battle ahead would not be fought by military might or human wisdom. Jericho's walls would fall, but not by hammer or fire. The victory would be God's, and Joshua's role would be obedience. The encounter ended as suddenly as it began, leaving Joshua with peace and divine assurance. That night, as Israel slept beneath the stars of the promised land, the camp radiated a quiet sense of destiny fulfilled. The covenant was renewed, the shame of Egypt was gone, the manna had ceased, and the commander of the Lord's army had appeared. Israel was ready, not because they were strong, but because their God was with them. The next chapter would bring miracles, warfare, and triumph beyond human understanding. But it all began here, at Gilgal, where God prepared his people for victory by first preparing their hearts. When dawn broke over the plains near Jericho, the city stood silent and watchful behind its massive double walls of stone and mud brick. The people of Jericho had long ceased their daily chatter and routines, for fear had settled upon their city like an unshakable shadow. They had heard of Israel's miraculous crossing of the Jordan and the reports of kings defeated on the far side of the wilderness. Their hearts melted with terror, and they locked themselves within their walls, abandoning the fields, the markets, and the gates. Jericho prepared not for battle but for siege, believing Israel would attack with force, siege ramps, or fire. But God had a different plan, one so unusual that no commander on earth would ever conceive it, yet one that would display his power in a way no human strategy could. Joshua, after his encounter with the commander of the Lord's army, waited for instructions with a mind open to the impossible. And the Lord spoke clearly: the victory over Jericho would be unlike any battle Israel had ever fought. Joshua summoned the priests, the warriors, and the tribal leaders. The air was tense as he relayed God's instructions: march around the city once a day for 6 days, accompanied by 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets made of ram's horns. The Ark of the Covenant, God's own presence, would follow behind them, surrounded by silent soldiers. No war cries. No arrows. No battering rams. Just a solemn procession circling the fortress. And on the 7th day, Israel would march around the city 7 times, and at Joshua's command, the priests would blow the trumpets, the people would shout with all their might, and God would cause the walls to fall. The leaders exchanged uncertain glances, soldiers shifted uneasily. Yet no one questioned God's instructions. The presence that had parted the Jordan could surely bring down the walls of Jericho. The first day's march began under a cloudless sky. The people of Jericho crowded atop the walls, peering down in bewilderment. Instead of war cries or assaults, they heard the steady steps of thousands of feet and the deep, haunting sound of ram's horns. Priests walked with solemn dignity, each step deliberate, the ark glimmering under the sun. Warriors marched silently, their hands resting on their weapons but not drawing them. The procession encircled the city once and then withdrew to the camp. Jericho's citizens were left in confusion, unsettled by something far more terrifying than battle, the unknown. On the 2nd day, the same procession reappeared. Again the priests sounded their trumpets, again the people marched in silence, and again the city watched with dread growing like an unseen storm. Mockery began from Jericho's walls, shouts of derision, insults thrown at the Israelites, laughter when no attack followed. But Israel did not respond. Their silence was not weakness, it was obedience. This disciplined quiet carved fear deeper into Jericho's heart. For what kind of people marched without speaking? What kind of army obeyed a command so strange? And what kind of God directed their steps? Days 3, 4, and 5 passed in the same pattern. The tension within Jericho rose with each morning. The crowds on the walls grew smaller, the mockery faded, and fear settled heavier. Mothers held children close, warriors kept their spears ready but felt powerless against a threat that made no logical sense. Inside the Israelite camp, the mood was different. A quiet faith grew with each completed march. The people came to understand that this battle was not theirs but God's. Their part was obedience, no matter how strange the instructions seemed. Each day they woke with anticipation, knowing they were participating in a miracle that had not yet unfolded. On the sixth day, Jericho's defenses seemed almost brittle beneath their imposing strength. The people on the walls no longer mocked; instead, they whispered anxiously, fearing what might come next. The Israelites marched their circle as faithfully as before, and at sunset returned to their camp with hearts pounding at the thought of the next day, the day of completion. The seventh day dawned with a golden glow, the sky painted with colors of promise and judgment. Before the sun rose, Joshua gathered the priests and the people. His voice carried the authority of a man who knew what was coming. "Today the Lord will give you this city." The people took their positions, priests with trumpets in front, the ark behind them, warriors surrounding them. As they approached Jericho, the city trembled, not physically, but in spirit. Today was different. Today Israel marched not once, but 7 times. Each circuit added weight to the moment, tension building with every step. Jericho's inhabitants watched in horror as the Israelites marched again and again, the pattern breaking, signaling something unprecedented. On the 7th march, when the procession completed its final circle, the entire nation held its breath. Joshua lifted his hand, the priests raised their trumpets. For a heartbeat, all of Canaan seemed suspended in silence. Then the sound exploded, the deep, resonant blast of 7 trumpets echoing like the cry of heaven itself. At Joshua's command the people shouted, a mighty, unified roar rising from thousands of hearts filled with faith, fear, hope, and awe. It was not a war cry born of human strength, it was a declaration that God fights for His people. At that very moment, the walls of Jericho trembled. A low rumble began beneath the earth, growing into a thundering quake. The massive stones that had stood unshaken for generations began to crack, shift, and collapse. Towers crumbled, gates shattered, and the impenetrable fortress fell flat. Dust filled the air, rising like smoke from a sacrificial offering. When the dust settled, Jericho lay open before Israel, not by human power but by divine intervention. Joshua directed the warriors to advance, sparing only Rahab and her family as promised. The spies who had once hidden under flax stalks now escorted her safely out of the ruins, her scarlet cord still hanging in the window, a symbol of faith and deliverance. Rahab's family joined Israel, becoming part of the covenant community, and her name would be remembered for generations as a testimony of faith that pleased God. As Israel burned the ruins of Jericho, they knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. This victory was not a result of strength or strategy but obedience and trust. And as the smoke rose into the sky, Joshua's fame spread throughout the land, not because of his power, but because the Lord was with him. After the dust of Jericho settled and the echoes of victory faded across the plains of Canaan, Israel's camp at Gilgal hummed with a sense of triumph and divine favor. Families spoke in awe of the miracle they had witnessed, massive walls collapsing at the sound of trumpets and a shout, Rahab rescued as promised, and God proving once again that the battle belonged to Him. Warriors sharpened their weapons with renewed confidence, mothers sang songs of deliverance, and even the youngest children played at reenacting the march around Jericho. Israel felt unstoppable, wrapped in the certainty that God's presence ensured victory after victory. Yet beneath the celebration, hidden deep within one tent, a secret burned like a buried coal that threatened to ignite a fire of judgment. Achan son of Carmi, from the tribe of Judah, had disobeyed God's explicit command to avoid taking anything from Jericho. While Israel destroyed the city as an offering devoted to the Lord, Achan's eyes had lingered on forbidden treasures, a beautiful Babylonian cloak, silver, and a bar of gold. Greed stirred in his heart, overpowering obedience. Quietly, he took the items, slipped them into his garments, and hid them beneath his tent. No one saw him. No one suspected. But God had seen, and the sin that remained hidden in men stood exposed before heaven. Joshua, unaware of the transgression, prepared the next step in Israel's conquest, the city of Ai, a smaller settlement nestled among the hills. Scouts surveyed Ai and returned with confidence, almost arrogance. "Do not send the whole army," they advised. 2,000 or 3,000 men are enough, for they are few. Encouraged by Jericho's miraculous defeat, Joshua agreed and sent about 3,000 warriors to take the city. The soldiers marched with confidence up the slopes toward Ai, expecting another swift victory. But when they approached, the men of Ai surged out with unexpected ferocity. Israel faltered, then panicked, fleeing downhill in confusion. 36 Israelites were struck down, and the rest retreated in shame. When the survivors returned to the camp breathless and broken, the entire nation reeled. How could this happen? Had God abandoned them? The victory at Jericho had been overwhelming, the defeat at Ai was devastating. Fear spread through the camp as easily as smoke from a smoldering fire. Joshua tore his robes and fell face down before the Ark of the Covenant, his voice heavy with grief and confusion. The elders joined him, throwing dust upon their heads, mourning not only the defeat but the possibility of God's displeasure. Joshua cried out, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you bring this people across the Jordan only to let us fall before the Amorites? What then will you do for your great name?" Joshua did not doubt God's power. He feared that Israel's failure would cause the nations to mock the Lord. But God's answer came swift and firm, cutting through Joshua's sorrow like a blade. "Stand up. Israel has sinned." These words struck Joshua like lightning. God continued, "They have taken some of the devoted things. They have lied, they have stolen, they have hidden them. That is why you cannot stand against your enemies." Israel's defeat was not due to military weakness but spiritual compromise. God's holiness demanded obedience, and sin within the camp had broken the covenant. Joshua stood trembling as God gave instructions. Israel must consecrate itself, and the guilty party would be revealed by tribe, clan, and household. The next morning the entire nation gathered as Joshua led them before the Lord. A heavy silence draped the camp as the tribes passed before Joshua. Millions watched with pounding hearts, wondering whose name would be called. God chose the tribe of Judah. The tension deepened as the clans approached. God selected the clan of the Zerahites. Then the households. Then the name, Achan son of Carmi. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Achan stood frozen, his face pale, his hands trembling. Joshua approached him with sorrow rather than anger, saying, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and tell me what you have done." Achan's shoulders slumped as the weight of his sin crushed his defenses. He confessed everything, the cloak, the silver, the gold, buried under his tent floor. His words echoed through the camp like a lamentation, for Israel knew what must happen next. Messengers ran to Achan's tent and found the stolen items exactly where he said. They laid the treasures before Joshua and before the Lord, a testimony of Achan's disobedience. Though the objects glittered under the sun, their shine could not hide the darkness they represented. Achan's sin was not a private matter, it had cost the nation a battle and the lives of innocent men. God's justice demanded cleansing. Joshua, the elders, and all Israel brought Achan, his family, and the stolen items to the valley of Acre, a place that would forever remember this moment. There, with solemn sorrow, Israel carried out God's judgment. The earth covered what had been corrupted, and the fire consumed what had defiled the camp. It was a brutal reminder that sin, though hidden, always brings destruction, not only to the sinner but to the community. When the judgment was complete, the Lord's anger turned away. The valley was named Acre, meaning trouble, for Achan had brought trouble upon Israel. That night, the camp lay quiet under the stars, not in celebration but reflection. Israel had seen what happened when a single act of disobedience stood between them and God's blessing. They understood now that victory was not guaranteed by numbers, strength, or strategy. God's presence, His favor, His holiness, His guidance, was their true power. Without it, they were no different from the nations they faced. Joshua walked through the camp, looking at the tents, the families, the warriors, knowing that the coming battles would require more than courage, they required obedience of the heart. And yet, beneath the sorrow, hope stirred. God had not abandoned Israel. The covenant stood firm. The defeat at Ai had been a warning, not a final judgment. Now that the sin was removed, God would lead them once more. The people lay down to sleep with hearts sobered but strengthened, ready to follow their God into the next chapter of conquest. The promised land still awaited them, and the God who had brought down Jericho's walls had not changed. He would fight for them again, if they walked in His ways. After the sorrowful cleansing of the camp and the heavy judgment upon Achan, Israel stood sober, humbled, and renewed in their commitment to follow the Lord with undivided hearts. The shame of defeat still lingered among the people, especially the warriors who had fled from Ai's men with fear pressing against their backs. Yet at the same time, a quiet strength had begun to rise, built upon the knowledge that the Lord had not abandoned His people. He had disciplined them, corrected them, and now He was ready to lead them again. Joshua prayed through the night, seeking direction for what came next, and as dawn brushed the horizon with strokes of pale gold, God spoke with a voice that revived Joshua's spirit, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you, and go up and attack Ai. I have delivered it into your hand." These words struck Joshua with the force of renewed purpose. God had taken away his anger, now He was giving them victory. The conquest of Ai would be different this time, not a result of arrogance or assumption, but of obedience and divine strategy. God gave Joshua a detailed plan, one that required precision, unity, and patience. Joshua was to set an ambush behind Ai while another force approached the city from the front. Ai's warriors, emboldened by their previous victory, would come out to meet Israel again, believing the Israelites were weak and disorganized. But this time, Israel would not flee in panic. They would draw Ai's army out of the city, then spring the trap at God's command. Joshua understood the brilliance of this divine strategy. It played upon Ai's pride, turning their past success into the very weapon that would destroy them. With fresh determination, Joshua summoned the strongest warriors and assigned 30,000 of them to hide behind Ai during the night. he instructed them quietly, "Stay hidden until I give the signal. The Lord will give us the city." The men nodded, their faces solemn yet confident. They moved silently under the cover of darkness, slipping across the terrain until they vanished into the hills behind Ai. Before dawn, Joshua prepared the rest of the army. This time, there would be no underestimating the enemy. Joshua himself led the front division toward Ai, and as the morning sun climbed the sky, the people of the city spotted Israel's forces approaching. A shout went up inside Ai's walls as their warriors gathered with excitement. They remembered the Israelite retreat, the fear they had instilled, and they were eager to repeat their victory. The king of Ai commanded his men to attack immediately, and they poured out of the city with confidence, leaving Ai unguarded in their wake. Joshua and the front division feigned fear and retreated, drawing the enemy farther and farther from the city. The men of Ai pursued with shouts of triumph, certain they were witnessing another easy conquest. Their pride blinded them to the divine strategy unfolding around them. As the last warriors left the city, Ai stood empty and vulnerable. Joshua had reached the appointed place where the Lord had told him to turn around. He lifted his spear high, holding it pointed toward the city, a signal to the ambushed troops hidden in the hills. The moment the spear rose, the men in ambush surged forward like a silent wave, running into the open gates of Ai. They quickly seized the city, setting fire to houses and strongholds. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and dark, rising like a pillar that could be seen from miles away. As Joshua and the front forces continued their staged retreat, they saw the smoke curling upward. At that moment Joshua lowered his spear and shouted, and Israel halted their withdrawal, turning suddenly to face the enemy. The men of Ai, who had been laughing and taunting only moments before, stopped in confusion. Their triumph froze as they saw flames devouring their city behind them. Panic surged through Ai's warriors. They were trapped between two forces, Israel's front division and the ambushed troops pouring out of the burning city. Fear replaced their arrogance as they realized the Israelites had not been fleeing, they had been obeying God. The enemy's shouts turned into screams as Israel attacked from both sides. Joshua's warriors fought with a new strength born not from pride but from God's restored presence. The men of Ai tried to run in every direction, but there was no escape. Their courage melted away like wax in the fire of Israel's renewed obedience. The Israelites pursued them across the plains, defeating them completely, just as the Lord had promised. As the battle concluded, Israel gathered the spoils of Ai, this time permitted by God. The gold, silver, livestock, and goods that had once tempted Achan were now freely given to the people. It was a reminder that God withholds no good thing from those who trust Him. The problem had never been the treasures themselves but the disobedience in taking what God had forbidden. Now, in obedience, the nation received abundance. Joshua then ordered the king of Ai to be brought before him. Judgment was carried out, and Ai was reduced to ruins, becoming a lasting reminder of what happens when nations rise against the God of Israel. Yet its destruction was not the focus of the day. Israel's victory was not merely military, it was spiritual. The defeat at Ai had taught them humility, the victory at Ai taught them trust. But Joshua was not finished. He knew that before Israel continued deeper into the land, they must renew their covenant with God publicly and completely. So Joshua gathered the entire nation, men, women, children, warriors, and priests, and led them northward to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the twin mountains where Moses had instructed Israel to declare blessings and curses. There, Joshua built an altar of uncut stones, just as God had commanded. Sacrifices were offered, smoke rising to heaven as a sign that Israel sought not only God's victories but His presence. Joshua wrote the words of the law on large stones, making the covenant visible and permanent. Then, standing between the two mountains, Joshua read aloud every blessing for obedience and every curse for disobedience. The people stood in reverent silence, listening to every word, understanding that conquest without covenant meant nothing. They were not merely taking land, they were taking their place as God's chosen people. When the ceremony ended, Israel felt renewed once more. They had learned that victory belonged to God alone, and obedience was their only path forward. The shame of defeat had been replaced by the joy of restored fellowship. The land ahead was vast, filled with powerful armies and fortified cities, but Israel now knew with certainty that the God who fought for them at Jericho and Ai would continue to fight for them, so long as they walked in His ways. When the victories at Jericho and Ai spread across the land, the kings of Canaan trembled. The news traveled like wildfire, walls collapsing at the sound of trumpets, a small city falling through divine strategy, the God of Israel fighting with unmistakable power. Many nations reacted as expected, with fear hardened into hostility. Kings from the hill country, plains, and western foothills began forming alliances, determined to unite against Israel before the Hebrews advanced any further. But while most prepared for war, one city chose a different path, one built not on strength, but on cunning. Gibeon, a powerful city with skilled warriors and strategic influence, saw the writing on the wall. They understood what their neighbors refused to accept: Israel's victories were impossible to explain by human strength alone. The God of heaven was with them. And if God had given Israel the land, resisting them meant destruction. The elders of Gibeon gathered in secret, crafting a bold plan that required deception, desperation, and risk. They would not fight Israel, they would seek mercy by disguising themselves as travelers from a faraway land. The plan was intricate. Men selected for the mission were dressed in worn-out clothing, tunics patched repeatedly, sandals cracked and dusty, and cloaks faded from artificial aging. Their donkeys were loaded with old sacks, and their wineskins were torn, mended with clumsy stitching to appear aged. Their bread was deliberately dried, crumbled, and hardened to the point that it looked months old. Every detail mattered. These men would claim they had traveled from a distant country beyond the reach of Israel's conquest. They would appeal not to Israel's fear but to Israel's honor, hoping Joshua and the leaders would make a treaty with them before discovering the truth. When their preparations were complete, the envoys set out from Gibeon, traveling only a short distance but acting as though they had journeyed for weeks across barren lands. As they approached the Israelite camp at Gilgal, their performance was convincing enough to draw immediate attention. Dust covered their faces, and their clothes hung loosely as if worn from endless travel. "We have come from a distant country," they said to Joshua and the leaders. "Make a treaty with us." Joshua regarded them carefully. The elders of Israel exchanged uncertain glances. Something about the request felt abrupt, too convenient. Joshua asked the question that mattered most: "Who are you? And where do you come from?" The envoys bowed deeply and replied, "Your servants come from a very distant land because of the fame of the Lord your God. We have heard reports of all he did in Egypt and to the kings beyond the Jordan. Their words were carefully chosen. They avoided mentioning Jericho or Ai, knowing Israel would suspect them if they claimed knowledge of events that occurred recently. Instead, they referenced miracles from years past, stories widely known throughout the region. Then they presented their props: cracked wineskins, moldy bread, and worn-out garments. "This bread of ours was worn when we packed it," they insisted. "But see how dry and crumbled it is now. Our clothes and sandals are worn from the long journey." The evidence seemed convincing, and Israel's leaders examined the items. Everything they touched appeared aged and weathered. But in this moment, this single, subtle moment, Israel made a grave mistake. The scripture says they did not inquire of the Lord. Joshua and the elders relied on what their eyes saw, not on what God would reveal. The deception worked. Joshua made a treaty with the envoys, promising peace and protection. The leaders of Israel swore an oath before the Lord, binding themselves to spare the Gibeonites. The envoys bowed in gratitude, hiding their relief beneath the disguise of humility. They returned home victorious, not through battle but through cunning. 3 days later the truth surfaced. Israel discovered that the supposed travelers from a distant land were actually neighbors, living only a short journey away. The revelation spread through the camp like a storm. Anger flared. Warriors demanded retribution. Leaders felt betrayed and humiliated. They had been tricked, and now their honor, and their oath, stood in question. Joshua gathered the elders, and they discussed what must be done. Though Israel had been deceived, the oath made in God's name could not be broken. To violate it would bring judgment upon the nation. "We have given them our oath," the leaders said, "and we must not touch them." Israel would keep the treaty, but consequences would follow for the Gibeonites' deception. Joshua summoned the Gibeonites. They stood trembling, knowing their lives depended entirely on Israel's mercy. Joshua's voice carried both authority and righteous disappointment. "Why did you deceive us? Why did you say you live far away when you dwell near us?" The Gibeonites bowed deeply, their faces lowered to the earth. "We feared for our lives," they confessed. "We knew the Lord your God commanded Moses to give you this land and to destroy all its inhabitants. We knew there was no hope for us except to seek mercy." Their honesty after deception struck Joshua. They had acted out of desperation, not defiance. They believed in the God of Israel more than many nations around them. Joshua declared their sentence: not death, but servitude. "Now you are cursed. You will never cease to serve as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God." The Gibeonites accepted their fate willingly. Better to serve than perish. Better to live as near servants to the God of Israel than die worshipping powerless idols. And so, the Gibeonites became servants at the tabernacle, supplying wood for sacrifices and water for worship. Ironically, the people who tried to save their lives through deception ended up living closer to God's presence than many Canaanites ever would. The treaty with Gibeon caused murmurs throughout Israel, but over time its significance became clear. Israel had learned an important lesson, one they would carry for generations: human wisdom cannot replace seeking God's guidance. The elders' mistake showed that deception can appear convincing when viewed through human eyes, but God sees truth beyond appearances. And though the treaty complicated Israel's conquest, God would soon use it to reveal His power again. For when the kings of Canaan learned that Gibeon had made peace with Israel, they would unite to attack the city, and Israel would be drawn into a miraculous battle where God himself hurled hailstones from heaven. The story of Gibeon was not merely about trickery, it was about mercy, consequence, and divine sovereignty. God had taken a moment of human failure and woven it into his larger plan. Israel had been tricked, but Israel had also been protected. And even their mistake became a stage upon which God would soon demonstrate his unmatched power in a battle unlike any before it. When rumors spread across the land that Gibeon had made peace with Israel, the shock was immediate and immense. Gibeon was not a small or insignificant settlement, it was a powerful city, greater than Ai and known for its mighty warriors. To the surrounding kingdoms, Gibeon's surrender was not simply an act of diplomacy, it was a declaration that Israel's God was unstoppable. Among the kings of Canaan, fear turned quickly into rage. They could not understand why Gibeon would betray their shared heritage of resistance. To them, such peace was treason. But to Gibeon, it had been the only path to survival. And now, the consequences of their choice were racing toward them like thunder. None felt the betrayal more personally than Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem. His city stood as a stronghold of the region, but even he trembled at the rapid rise of Israel. Jericho had fallen miraculously, Ai had been reduced to ashes, and now the influential Gibeonites had defected without a fight. Adonizedek saw clearly what others hesitated to admit: if Israel continued gaining allies at this pace, the rest of Canaan would fall with ease. Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately. So he sent messengers to 4 neighboring kings, the kings of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, urging them to unite as one force. His message was simple and urgent: Gibeon has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites. Come up to me and help me attack Gibeon, for it has betrayed us all. The other kings, driven by fear and wounded pride, agreed. They gathered their armies, forming a coalition more formidable than anything Israel had yet faced. But their anger was not directed at Israel, it was directed at Gibeon. As the armies marched toward Gibeon, the Gibeonites looked out from their city walls and felt fear grip their hearts. They had hoped their treaty with Israel would bring security, not immediate war. Now 5 kings were coming to destroy them, not because of Israel's threat but because of their allegiance to Israel's God. They had placed themselves under Joshua's protection, and so they acted on the covenant they had secured. They sent messengers racing to Israel's camp at Gilgal. The messengers arrived breathless, falling before Joshua. "Do not abandon your servants," they pleaded. "Come up to us quickly and save us. For all the kings of the Amorites have joined forces against us." Joshua listened, absorbing the weight of the situation. Although the Gibeonites had deceived Israel, the oath remained binding. Israel had sworn before God to protect them, and breaking that oath would bring God's judgment. More than that, Joshua sensed that God was turning even this complicated alliance into an opportunity to demonstrate his power. As Joshua prepared his army, the Lord spoke with unmistakable clarity: "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them will be able to stand against you." These words ignited courage in Joshua's heart. Israel marched through the night, ascending from Gilgal to Gibeon under a sky shimmering with stars, moving swiftly and silently across rugged terrain. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of Gibeon, catching the 5 kings' armies by surprise. The coalition had expected to crush Gibeon long before Israel could arrive, but instead they found themselves facing an army strengthened by God and fueled by divine command. The battle erupted with sudden fury. Israel charged forward with the confidence of warriors who knew God was fighting beside them. The armies of the 5 kings tried to hold their formation, but they were overwhelmed from the moment the fighting began. The surprise attack shattered their lines, and panic rippled through their ranks. Yet as powerful as Israel fought, something far greater was happening above them. Dark clouds gathered suddenly, swirling with supernatural force. The sky twisted, and from the heavens came the roar of divine judgment. Massive hailstones began to fall, stones so large and deadly no human weapon could rival them. They hurled down with terrifying precision, striking the enemy armies while Israel stood untouched. Warriors who had marched proudly only hours earlier were now crushed under the weight of God's wrath. Scripture later recorded that more enemies died from the hail than from Israel's swords, a testimony that this battle belonged to the Lord alone. Still, Joshua saw that the enemy was fleeing, and the day was fading. If darkness fell, many of the king's soldiers would escape into the night. Joshua's heart burned with determination. This victory needed to be complete, final, undeniable. And so he prayed a prayer so bold, so extraordinary, that it echoed across history: "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Ajalon." The people looked upward in awe as the impossible happened. The sun halted in the sky, refusing to set. The moon paused. Time itself bent under God's command. The battle continued in extended daylight as Israel pursued their enemies across the countryside, striking them until none remained to regroup or resist. Never before, and never again, had God answered a prayer in this exact way, stopping the movements of heaven so that His purposes on earth could be fulfilled. When the last enemy fell and Israel returned to Joshua, the victory was total. The 5 kings had fled and hidden in a cave at Makkedah. Joshua ordered the cave sealed with stones until the battle was finished. Later, the kings were brought out before Israel as a symbol of God's triumph over the nations. Their defeat was not merely military, it was spiritual. These kings had risen against the God of Israel, and their downfall declared to all of Canaan that the Lord alone was sovereign. As Israel continued their conquest, the story of the battle at Gibeon spread far and wide. The stopping of the sun, the hailstones from heaven, the crushing of 5 united kings, these events shook the land to its core. No one could deny that Israel's victories were the work of a divine power far beyond human strength. Gibeon, once threatened by annihilation, now stood secure under Israel's protection. Their choice, though born from fear and deception, had placed them on the side of the only true God. And Israel had learned a profound truth as well: God could take even their mistakes, their failure to inquire of Him about the treaty, and turn them into opportunities for His glory. The battle against the 5 kings was more than a military triumph, it was a revelation of God's dominion over nature, nations, and time itself. Israel moved forward from Gibeon not only stronger in battle but deeper in faith, knowing that the God who commanded hail and halted the sun would continue to lead them through every challenge ahead. When the final echoes of battle faded across the hills near Gibeon and the shattered armies of the 5 kings lay strewn across the valleys, Joshua gathered his men for the final act of judgment. The miraculous day, where the sun had stood still in the heavens and hailstones had fallen like divine arrows, had shaken Israel to its core. They had witnessed firsthand that God not only fought beside them but commanded the very elements for their sake. Yet the victory was not fully complete. The 5 kings who had united against Gibeon and defied Israel's God remained alive, trapped inside the cave of Makkedah where they had fled in desperation. They thought darkness would hide them, but God had exposed their hiding place, and now it was time for Israel to confront them face to face. The warriors gathered around Joshua, weary but strengthened by triumph. Dust clung to their sandals, and their armor bore the marks of combat. Still, none doubted what must be done. Joshua commanded his officers to open the cave. The soldiers rolled away the massive stones that had sealed the entrance, and the dim interior breathed out a cold, stale air. From within, the 5 kings were brought out: Adonizedek of Jerusalem, Holm of Hebron, Piram of Jarmuth, Japhi of Lachish, and Debir of Eglon. Their faces were pale, drained of the pride and defiance they once held. They had stood as powerful rulers, confident in their alliance. Now they stood trembling before the man God had appointed to lead Israel. Joshua looked upon them not with human rage but with divine certainty. He knew this moment was not about politics or vengeance. It was about God fulfilling His promise to give Israel victory over every nation that opposed His purposes. As the kings knelt before him, Joshua turned to the military commanders who had fought so faithfully. "Come here," he said. "Put your feet on the necks of these kings." The officers stepped forward, some still stunned by the boldness of the command, others feeling a rising sense of awe. They placed their feet on the necks of the defeated kings, a symbolic act that declared complete dominance. But more importantly, it was a lesson from God. Joshua spoke loudly enough for every soldier to hear: "Do not be afraid or discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you fight." The gesture was not meant to humiliate the kings but to strengthen Israel's faith. God wanted His people to see with their own eyes that no force, no alliance, no earthly power could stand against the Lord's plans. The 5 kings were living proof. After speaking, Joshua carried out the judgment. The kings were put to death, and their bodies were hung on trees until evening, the customary sign of divine justice. The message was clear: God had rendered His verdict against the rulers who dared oppose Him. When the sun began to set, Joshua ordered their bodies taken down and thrown back into the cave where they had hidden. The entrance was sealed again with stones, marking the site as a permanent reminder of God's justice in battle. The cave, once a place of refuge for fearful kings, became their tomb and a monument to the God who sees all things hidden and brings all things to light. Joshua did not allow the army to rest long. The day's victory had weakened Canaan's alliances, and Israel needed to press forward before the nations could regroup. Joshua led the warriors from Makkedah to Libnah, and God delivered the city into their hands. Every battle unfolded with the same pattern: God went before them, Israel obeyed, and victory followed. From Libnah they marched to Lachish, where they fought fiercely for 2 days. During the battle, the king of Gezer came to aid Lachish, but Israel struck him down as well. The momentum of conquest grew like a river, gaining strength until nothing could hold it back. Next, Joshua turned toward Eglon. The city was quickly encircled and overtaken, its resistance brief. From Eglon, the path led to Hebron, and from Hebron to Debir. Each king, each army, each fortified city fell one after another like stones collapsing in a divine pattern. The battles blurred in the memories of the warriors, not because they were insignificant, but because they were so overwhelming in their consistency. Everywhere Israel marched, God handed over victory. Scripture later described it simply: Joshua conquered the whole region, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. But to fully grasp the weight of these conquests, one must imagine the emotions of the Israelites who had lived through decades of wandering. Many had grown up hearing stories of giants, fortified cities, and powerful kings who could never be defeated. Parents had warned them of the dangers that awaited in Canaan. Yet now, under Joshua's leadership, those very obstacles were falling one by one. They were witnessing the fulfillment of promises older than their grandparents, promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Every city taken, every king defeated, every enemy scattered was living testimony that God keeps His word even when generations pass. Still, victory did not make Israel arrogant. Joshua consistently reminded them that these triumphs were not achieved through their strength. They were servants of a God who commanded the sun and hail, a God whose power dwarfed the mightiest kings. The soldiers felt a mixture of awe, humility, and gratitude. They knew their victories were miracles, not mere battles. And though exhaustion pressed upon their bodies, their spirits grew stronger with each step. As Israel completed the southern campaign, Joshua and the army returned to the base camp at Gilgal, carrying with them the weight of both battle and blessing. The people welcomed them with cries of joy, praising the Lord for His faithfulness. The young children stared with wide eyes at the warriors who returned from victories beyond imagination. Mothers embraced their sons. Elders lifted their hands toward heaven. And Joshua, though celebrated, remained humble. He looked not at the glory of conquest but at the covenant. He knew the land was not yet fully taken, battles still lay ahead. But he also knew that the God who had given them the southern kingdoms would give them the north, the west, and every territory promised. The cave of Makeda became a silent witness to all that had happened, a dark chamber once used for fear, now sealed as a symbol of divine triumph. Israel would move on, but the memory remained. The 5 kings who once threatened the land now lay buried beneath stones, while the nation chosen by God stood stronger, united, and assured of victory. The lesson echoed through every campfire and through every generation: when God fights for His people, no enemy can stand, no alliance can prevail, and no darkness can hide those who set themselves against His will. As the dust of the southern campaign settled and Israel returned to Gilgal with victory echoing through their ranks, the land of Canaan trembled. Word of Joshua's triumph spread swiftly: Jericho fallen by God's command, Ai consumed by flame, 5 mighty kings crushed in the valley of Gibeon, and the sun itself halted in the sky at Israel's request. No one could deny that a divine power guided their every step. And yet, fear does not always lead to surrender. Sometimes it drives rulers to desperate alliances. In the northern regions of Canaan, home to vast territories and fortified cities superior even to those in the south, kings gathered in secret councils. They knew the southern coalition had failed spectacularly, but instead of turning their hearts toward repentance, they hardened them like iron. They decided that their only hope lay in unified resistance. Their leader would be Gibeon, king of Hazor, a city renowned for its strength, wealth, and influence. Hazor was considered the head of all northern kingdoms, and Gibeon commanded respect. He summoned kings from the hill country, the plains near Galilee, the slopes of Mount Hermon, and the vast stretches of land near the Great Sea. The coalition that formed under his leadership was not a loose gathering of weak cities but the most formidable alliance Israel would ever face. The armies that answered Gibeon's call were staggering in number. Scripture describes them as numerous as the sand on the seashore, accompanied by horses and chariots, military technology Israel had never encountered in such scale. Chariots were the tanks of the ancient world, swift and deadly. Israel, on the other hand, fought on foot, armed with courage rather than metal and horses. To an outside observer, the Northern Alliance seemed unbeatable, a force capable of crushing Joshua's army in a single blow. But as the kings prepared for war, God watched from the heavens, and their rebellion stirred not admiration but judgment. They gathered at the waters of Merom, confident in their numbers, certain they could overwhelm Israel by sheer force. As the ground shook beneath the weight of countless soldiers and rumbling chariot wheels, messengers rushed to Joshua with news of the impending threat. The report would have terrified any ordinary commander. The numbers alone were intimidating, the chariots overwhelming, the coordination unprecedented. But Joshua was not an ordinary commander. He was a servant of the living God. As Joshua prayed, the Lord spoke with clarity that infused him with unshakable courage. Do not be afraid of them. By this time tomorrow, I will hand all of them over to Israel. You will hamstring their horses and burn their chariots. The message was unmistakable. God would once again deliver an impossible victory, and Israel's responsibility was obedience. Joshua rose with renewed strength, gathered the entire army, and prepared for a surprise assault. Just as the northern kings had gathered in numbers beyond imagination, Israel moved silently through the night, guided not by moonlight but by divine confidence. When dawn broke, Israel charged down upon the armies at Merom with such speed and ferocity that the northern coalition was thrown into chaos. Their leaders had expected Israel to cower at the sight of chariots. They never imagined a direct attack. Before the soldiers of Hazor could align their formations, Israel was already among them, swords flashing, voices shouting, and the power of God pushing the battle in their favor. The scene erupted into confusion. Chariots struggled to maneuver on the uneven terrain near the waters. Horses reared as Israel's warriors flooded the battlefield. The northern kings shouted commands, but their voices were drowned out by the clash of steel and cries of panic. What had begun as a display of military superiority crumbled into disorder as God's presence shook the resolve of Israel's enemies. The coalition broke apart. Soldiers scattered in every direction, some fleeing north toward the foothills, others south into valleys, others west toward fortified towns. Joshua pursued them relentlessly, fulfilling every detail of God's command. No matter where the enemy ran, Israel overtook them. The chariots, once symbols of invincible power, were captured and burned. Their horses, symbols of military dominance, were hamstrung, ensuring that Israel would not rely on foreign strength in future battles. This victory was not simply military, it was theological. God was proving once again that Israel's triumphs depended not on human strategies or weapons but on the power of heaven. When the battle ended, the northern coalition lay shattered. But Joshua's work was not complete. God had commanded him to destroy Hazor, the center of northern resistance, the city that had led the rebellion. As Israel marched toward Hazor, they saw its magnificence, its fortifications towering, its influence radiating across the region. Yet its greatness only made its downfall more significant. Joshua captured the city, destroyed its king, and burned Hazor to the ground. It became the only major city in the conquest that Joshua burned completely. The destruction of Hazor was symbolic. The head of the rebellion was cut off, ensuring the northern resistance would never rise again. From there, Joshua continued to sweep across the northern territories, conquering cities, subduing kings, and securing every portion of the land God had promised. The battles were long and grueling, not won in a single day but fought over extended campaigns. Joshua's leadership never faltered. He pursued God's commands with relentless obedience, ensuring no survivors of the resisting nations remained. By the end of the northern campaign, Israel stood victorious from the southern borders to the northern peaks. The land groaned beneath the weight of its fallen kings, but it also breathed with the hope of new beginnings. When Joshua returned to Gilgal with his army, the people celebrated not only the victory but the faithfulness of their God. The promised land, once filled with towering enemies and seemingly impenetrable fortresses, was now subdued beneath Israel's feet. Joshua had fought dozens of kings, yet the true victor was always the Lord. Israel understood that their conquest was not the story of a powerful nation rising, it was the story of a covenant-keeping God fulfilling ancient promises. And though the wars had not yet fully ended, and smaller pockets of resistance remained, the major strongholds of Canaan had fallen. The land was ready to be divided among the tribes. Israel had survived the giants, conquered the chariots, shattered the alliances, and subdued the kings. But more importantly, Israel had learned to trust the God who had never abandoned them. As they looked upon the vast land now under their control, they knew this truth deeply: no enemy, no matter how numerous or powerful, could stand against the Lord who fought for his people. When the northern kings had been subdued and the land at last lay quiet beneath Israel's feet, a different kind of work began, one not marked by swords and marching armies, but by careful planning, sacred responsibility, and the fulfillment of promises older than any living Israelite. Joshua, now older yet still unwavering in purpose, gathered the leaders of the tribes. For years they had fought side by side, driven by the urgency of battle, but now God called them into a new season, the division of the promised inheritance. The land that had been spoken of to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land flowing with milk and honey, was ready to be placed into the hands of their descendants. It was time to shift from conquering to dwelling, from claiming to cultivating, from fighting to flourishing. Joshua stood before the elders, commanders, judges, and officers of Israel, the weight of decades of leadership resting upon him like a mantle woven by God himself. His voice, though aged, carried the authority of a man who had walked through every chapter of Israel's deliverance, from Egypt's oppression to the wilderness wandering, from the Jordan River's parting to the shouts before Jericho's walls. Now he addressed a nation that had grown into a people ready to possess their inheritance. "The Lord has given us rest on every side," he proclaimed, "just as he promised our fathers. It is time to divide the land among the tribes." But before Joshua began assigning territories, the Lord spoke once more, reminding him that much land remained unexplored and unconquered, territories of the Philistines, regions of the Sidonians, and pockets of resistance scattered along the coastline and mountains. God assured Joshua that he himself would drive out the rest of the inhabitants. Israel's task was to settle where God placed them and continue trusting in his power. With that divine reassurance, Joshua began the monumental process of dividing the land. First came the tribes of Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh, the largest and most influential tribes. Judah, from whom the line of David and ultimately the Messiah would come, received a vast region stretching from the southern wilderness to the foothills and fertile valleys. The land bore the marks of promise: rich soil, fortified towns, vineyards waiting to be restored. Ephraim and the western half of Manasseh received their inheritance in the central highlands, a region of strategic importance. Yet the assignment came with warnings. Many Canaanite cities remained strong, and Israel was not to grow complacent. They were to push onward, drive out the remaining inhabitants, and trust God to make a way. The daughters of Zelophehad had approached Joshua during this time, reminding him of Moses' ruling concerning their right to inherit their father's land. Joshua, honoring both the law and their bold faith, granted them their portion, an act that showcased Israel's commitment to justice and God's care for every family, even those without male heirs. As the distribution continued, the remaining tribes grew anxious. 7 tribes had yet to receive their inheritance because they had not surveyed the land. Joshua, perceiving their hesitation, rebuked them gently but firmly. "How long will you wait before taking possession of the land the Lord has given you?" His words stirred them to action. Joshua appointed 3 men from each of the 7 tribes to survey the land and write down descriptions of the remaining territories. These men traveled across plains and mountains, valleys and riverbanks, mapping every region not yet claimed. They returned with scrolls filled with detailed accounts, and using these descriptions, Joshua cast lots before the Lord, ensuring every assignment came not from human preference but divine order. Benjamin received a region nestled between Judah and Ephraim, a land that would one day hold Jerusalem itself. Simeon's inheritance fell within Judah's territory, for Judah's portion proved too large. Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan received lands stretching toward the northern mountains and western coastlines, areas filled with fertile fields, forests, and access to trade routes. Each tribe's assignment held specific purpose, woven by God into the future story of Israel. One tribe, however, received no territorial inheritance: the tribe of Levi. They were set apart as priests, chosen to serve in the house of the Lord, ministering at the altar and teaching the law. Instead of land, they received towns scattered throughout Israel, along with surrounding pasturelands. Their inheritance, God proclaimed, was the Lord Himself. This arrangement ensured that spiritual guidance would be present in every region of the nation, binding Israel's unity not by borders but by worship. When the division was nearly complete, a tribe approached Joshua with reverence, the tribe of Joseph, speaking on behalf of Ephraim and Manasseh. They expressed concern that their land was not large enough for their growing populations. Joshua listened patiently, then challenged them: "If the hill country is too small, go up into the forest and clear it. You are a great people with great strength. Drive out the Canaanites, even though they have iron chariots." His response served as both encouragement and reminder: the land God gives is meant to be cultivated with courage, not complained over. As the final boundaries were drawn, Joshua received his own inheritance last. Though he had led Israel through countless battles, he waited until every tribe was settled before accepting his portion. The people granted him the town of Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. With humility, Joshua rebuilt it and made it his home. His life had been spent in service, and even in inheritance he stood as an example of selfless leadership. With the land divided, Israel entered a new season. Cities once fortified against them now echoed with the sounds of children playing, families building homes, and fields being cultivated. Olive groves flourished, vineyards blossomed, and herds grazed on hillsides that had been barren for generations. The wilderness wandering was a distant memory. Now the people lived in the richness of God's promises. They no longer pitched temporary tents but built permanent dwellings. They no longer ate manna but harvested grain. They no longer wandered without direction but walked within borders granted by God Himself. Yet even in peace, Joshua knew the nation must remain vigilant. The land was a gift, but it required faithfulness to keep. As the tribes settled into their territories, the story of Israel transformed from one of conquest to one of stewardship. The inheritance was given not only to fulfill ancient promises but to prepare the nation for its future, a future that would unfold through judges, kings, prophets, exile, and eventually redemption through the one who would come from the line of Judah. The dividing of the inheritance was not simply an administrative task. It was the unfolding of divine destiny, the shaping of a nation into the form God had ordained. Israel, once a wandering people, now stood rooted in a land crafted for their flourishing, carrying the covenant forward for generations to come. When the land at last found rest from war and the tribes were settled in the inheritance God had appointed for each of them, Joshua, now an elderly man, felt the weight of time pressing gently yet firmly upon his shoulders. His hair had grown white, his movements slower, but his eyes still held the fire of faith, the same fire he carried as a young spy who once stood against the fear of an entire generation. Joshua had led Israel through battles, miracles, victories, and judgment. He had seen the mighty hand of God move in ways no mortal could ever forget. And now, sensing that his life was nearing its twilight, he knew there remained one final task: securing the heart of Israel. It was not enough that they possessed the land, they must also remain faithful to the God who gave it. For Joshua understood the dangers that come not in times of war, but in times of peace. He summoned all Israel to one place: elders, judges, officers, heads of tribes, and countless families who had once marched through wilderness sands and now dwelt in homes they did not build, eating from vineyards they did not plant. They gathered at Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood, glowing softly beneath the sun. Joshua rose to address them, leaning on his staff, his weathered face illuminated with solemn purpose. The murmurs quieted until only the crackle of nearby fires and the gentle breeze across the land could be heard. Then Joshua's voice, though aged, echoed with the same authority that once commanded armies. "You have seen everything the Lord your God has done for you," he began, sweeping his arm across the people. "It was the Lord who fought for you." Heads nodded, eyes softened. They remembered Jericho's fallen walls, Ai's ambush, the sun that stood still at Gibeon, the hailstones from heaven, and the countless kings who trembled before Israel's God. Joshua continued, "I have allotted to you the land of these nations, yet the Lord will still drive out the rest. Be strong, be very strong, to keep and to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses." His words carried the weight of warning as much as encouragement. Joshua had fought external enemies, but he knew internal dangers were more subtle and far more deadly. "Do not associate with the nations that remain among you," he cautioned. "Do not invoke their gods or swear by them. Hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now." Joshua's voice grew firmer, his eyes narrowing with sharp clarity. "If you turn away from him," he warned, and cling to the nations around you. If you intermarry with them or serve their gods, know for certain that the Lord will no longer drive out these nations. They will become a snare, a trap, thorns in your sides, and whips on your backs, until you perish from this good land." Silence settled heavily over the assembly. The people knew Joshua spoke truth. They had witnessed the consequences of disobedience before: the plague after the golden calf, the serpents in the wilderness, the deaths of those who rebelled under Korah, and the tragic defeat at Ai because of hidden sin. Joshua's warning struck deeply. The God who had fought for them in battle expected purity and peace. Joshua paused, gathering his strength. "I am now old," he said quietly. "You know it. You see it." A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. Joshua had been their leader for so long that imagining life without him felt like staring at a horizon without sun. Yet Joshua was not finished. "You also know," he said firmly, "that every promise the Lord your God made has been fulfilled. Not one of his good words has failed." His declaration rose like a flame, burning away doubt and calling the people to remembrance. Joshua's life itself was a living testimony that God keeps his promises, not partially, not occasionally, but completely. After addressing them broadly, Joshua gathered all Israel again, this time at Shechem, a place heavy with sacred history. It was at Shechem that God had first appeared to Abraham and promised him descendants and land. It was at Shechem Jacob buried his foreign idols beneath an oak tree. It was at Shechem that Joshua renewed Israel's covenant earlier in their conquest. Now, Joshua returned to this sacred ground to deliver his final charge. He stood before the assembly and spoke not with his own words but as a mouthpiece for God. In a sweeping speech, Joshua recounted Israel's entire story, from Abraham's call out of idolatry, to the birth of Isaac, to the deliverance from Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the wilderness journey, and the conquest of the land. Every word reminded them that their identity was rooted in God's faithfulness. Then Joshua turned from history to decision. "Now fear the Lord," he said, "and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." His next words became one of the most iconic declarations in all of Scripture: "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The words struck like thunder. A murmur of conviction rippled through the people. They responded with passion, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." Joshua's eyes softened, but he did not allow emotion to overshadow truth. "You are witnesses against yourselves," he warned, "that you have chosen to serve the Lord." And the people said, "We are witnesses." Joshua then commanded them, "Throw away the foreign gods among you and yield your hearts fully to the Lord." Once more the people answered, "We will serve the Lord our God." Their voices rose in unison like the roar of a mighty river. Joshua then made a covenant with the people that day. He wrote the words of the covenant in the book of the law and set up a large stone under an oak near the sanctuary. "This stone will be a witness," he said. "It has heard everything the Lord said to us. It will testify against you if you are unfaithful." The symbol stood as a constant reminder that serving God was not merely a declaration, it was a lifelong commitment. When the covenant ceremony ended, Joshua dismissed the people to their inheritance. Families returned to their lands, elders to their tribes, warriors to their homes. Joshua watched them go, knowing he had done all he could to anchor them in faith before his departure. Israel had rest, prosperity, and the presence of God among them. Whether they remained faithful would determine their future. Joshua, servant of the Lord, had completed his final mission, not of conquering land, but of guarding the heart of a nation. The man who once stood overlooked beside Moses had become the shepherd of Israel. And now, as he prepared to leave this world, he entrusted the people to the God who had been faithful from the very beginning. As the sun dipped gently behind the hills of Ephraim, casting long shadows across the land that now belonged to Israel, the weight of years settled upon Joshua like a warm yet heavy mantle. He had lived through an era of miracles, crossing the Red Sea as a young man, spying out the land of Canaan with Caleb while the rest of Israel trembled, wandering through the wilderness with a rebellious generation, and finally leading a new generation into the fulfillment of promises spoken centuries earlier. Yet now, Joshua sensed that his time on earth was drawing to a close. His body, though still strong in spirit, had grown frail with age. But the fire of devotion within him had not dimmed. He had one last message for Israel, one final farewell that would echo through the generations long after his voice was gone. Joshua summoned the tribes of Israel to gather once more, a final assembly of God's people before the passing of their great leader. They arrived from every corner of the land, families from the plains, elders from the mountains, priests from the tabernacle at Shiloh, warriors who had once marched behind him in battle, and young men who knew him only as the hero of their fathers' stories. As they gathered, a solemn anticipation filled the air. Joshua, leaning on his staff, stood before them near his home in Timnath-Serah, overlooking the inheritance that the Lord had given him. The land stretched far and wide, fertile and peaceful, a testament to divine faithfulness. He lifted his voice, and a hush fell over the crowd. "I am old," he began, "and advanced in years. You yourselves have seen all that the Lord your God has done for you. He has fought for you. He has driven out great nations and powerful kings before you. The land you stand upon is the gift of his hand, not the work of your own." Joshua paused, sweeping his gaze across the assembly. Children clung to their parents, elders leaned forward to catch every word, and warriors stood with bowed heads. They all understood the significance of this moment. Joshua continued, reminding them of God's covenant. "Hold fast to the Lord your God. Love him. Walk in his ways. Do not turn aside to the gods of the nations around you, for if you cling to them, trouble will surely come upon you. The Lord will not tolerate divided hearts." His voice trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with deep emotion. "Not one of all his promises has failed," he said, his tone rising with conviction. "Every word has come to pass. But just as he has fulfilled his promises for good, he will also fulfill his warnings if you turn away." These words were not threats, but truth that Joshua had witnessed over and over in his long life. Israel nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with blessing. Joshua then recounted the story of their journey once more, not as a history lesson, but as a call to remembrance. He spoke of Abraham, called out of idolatry, of Isaac and Jacob, heirs of the covenant, of Moses, who confronted Pharaoh through God's power, of the plagues, the Passover, and the deliverance from Egypt, of the Red Sea that swallowed their enemies, of manna in the wilderness, of battles won through divine strength, of victories that no human strategy could explain. "You stand here today," Joshua said, "because the Lord carried you every step of the way. Tears glisten in the eyes of many as they remember the hardships, miracles, and mercies that had shaped their identity as God's people. Then Joshua spoke the words that would define his legacy: "Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of this land. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The declaration rang across the valley like a trumpet blast. Israel responded with one voice: "We will serve the Lord." Their shout rose like a wave, echoing through the hills. Yet Joshua knew the human heart. He knew that passion in a moment could fade with time. "You are witnesses against yourselves," he told them, "that you have chosen the Lord." The people agreed, and Joshua set up a large stone beneath an oak tree near the sanctuary of the Lord at Shechem. "This stone will be a witness," he said. "It has heard all the words the Lord has spoken to us. It will testify against you if you are unfaithful." The people nodded, acknowledging the seriousness of their vow. When the covenant ceremony ended, Joshua dismissed the assembly, and the tribes returned to their land. Families walked back to their homes in peace, reflecting on the leader who had guided them so faithfully. Joshua watched them go, his heart full yet heavy. He knew they would face trials. He knew they would be tempted. But he also knew that God had promised to remain with them as long as they remained with him. Joshua breathed deeply, feeling the cool breeze of evening pass across his face. Not long after this gathering, Joshua son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. Israel mourned deeply. They buried him in the land of his inheritance, in the hill country of Ephraim, at Timnath-Serah. And as the generations reflected upon his life, they recognized that Joshua had been more than a warrior, more than a commander, more than a leader. He had been a faithful servant, a man who trusted God when few others did, a man who saw beyond giants and fortified cities to the greatness of God, a man who never took the glory for himself but gave it always to the Lord. After his death, Israel continued to serve the Lord throughout the days of the elders who had known Joshua, for his influence endured in their memories and in their hearts. His final farewell was not merely a speech, it was a legacy. It called Israel to obedience, courage, and unwavering devotion. And though the land now rested from war, the spiritual battle for faithfulness had only begun. Joshua's life stood as a shining example of what it means to walk with God, to trust Him fully, follow Him boldly, and finish faithfully. As the twilight settled over the ancient city of Jericho and torches flickered along its mighty walls, the hearts of its inhabitants throbbed with fear. Rumors had swept across the land like a fierce desert wind, rumors of a people who walked with the living God. Stories of seas split apart, of kings defeated, of armies crumbling before them now haunted the sleep of Jericho's warriors. Even the strongest men, those who had stood unshaken in countless battles, now whispered nervously of Israel encamped across the Jordan. Amid this rising dread lived a woman named Rahab, whose house was built into the city wall itself. Though her reputation was known to all, her heart was unlike any other in Jericho, for somewhere deep within her, a seed of belief had begun to take root, belief in a God she had never seen but whose power could not be denied. One quiet evening, as shadows stretched long across the streets, two strangers approached Rahab's door. Their clothing, their accents, their cautious behavior revealed they were not merchants or travelers, they were spies. Israelite spies. Sent by Joshua to survey the fortified city, they had slipped through the gates before they closed, hoping to blend in among the evening crowds. But Jericho was on high alert. No unfamiliar face went unnoticed. The moment Rahab opened her door to them, she understood the danger. Yet something stirred inside her, a conviction that this moment was not chance, but destiny. Without hesitation, she ushered them inside. Word traveled fast in Jericho. Before long, the king's messengers knocked at Rahab's door. "Bring out the men who came to you," they demanded. "They have entered your house to spy out the land." Rahab's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension coil tight in her chest. Hiding the men beneath bundles of flax on her rooftop, she descended the stairs with calm resolve. Facing the messengers, she spoke with steady voice. "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. When it was time to close the city gate, they left. I do not know where they went. Pursue them quickly, you may catch up with them." Her deception sent the soldiers rushing out into the night, chasing shadows along the road to the Jordan. When the voices faded, Rahab climbed to the rooftop. There, under the starlit sky, she looked upon the two spies trembling beneath the flax. "I know," she said softly yet with unshakable clarity, "that the Lord has given you this land. Fear has fallen on all of us. We have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea, how he defeated Sihon and Og. When we heard these things, our hearts melted. No courage remained in any of us because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth beneath." Her confession hung in the air like a holy truth, spoken by a woman who had lived her entire life surrounded by idols, yet whose heart recognized the true God when his works were revealed. Rahab then pleaded, "Now swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Save my father, mother, brothers, and sisters from death." The spies looked at her with gratitude, moved by her boldness and touched by her unexpected faith. "Our lives for yours," they replied, "if you do not reveal our mission. When the Lord gives us the land, we will show kindness and faithfulness to you." Rahab nodded and, with quick thinking, took a scarlet cord, a simple rope that would become a symbol of salvation, and prepared to lower them through her window, for her home stood upon the city wall. "Go to the hills," she instructed, "hide there for 3 days until the pursuers return, then go your way." Before the men descended, they gave Rahab their solemn vow. "Tie this scarlet cord in your window. Gather your family inside your house. Anyone inside will be spared when we enter the city. But if anyone leaves your house, their blood will be on their own head." Rahab agreed, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She let them down the wall, watching as they disappeared into the darkness. The moment the rope slipped from her hands, she tied it firmly in the window, its red color glowing faintly in the dim moonlight, a declaration of trust in the God of Israel. The spies hid in the hills for 3 days, just as Rahab had advised. Meanwhile, the king's soldiers returned from their futile search, weary and frustrated. When the spies finally crossed the Jordan back to Joshua, they delivered a report filled not with fear but with confidence. "The Lord has surely given the land into our hands. The people's hearts melt with fear because of us." Their words strengthened Israel's resolve, but it was Rahab's faith that shone brightest in Joshua's mind, a beacon of hope amid the terrors of war. Back in Jericho, Rahab waited. Each day she looked upon the scarlet cord in her window, running her fingers along its rough fibers. It was more than a signal, it was a promise. A lifeline. A sign that the God of Israel, unlike the God she had grown up with, was living and powerful. The days passed slowly, punctuated by distant rumors of Israel preparing to cross the Jordan. When word reached the city that the river itself had stopped flowing for them, a miracle witnessed by many, panic swept through Jericho like wildfire. The gates shut tight. No one entered or left. But Rahab's heart did not melt with fear like the others. She clung to the cord. She clung to the promise. She clung to the God she had chosen to trust. Soon the sound of marching reached the walls, the rhythmic, unified steps of thousands. Yet no battle cry followed. Instead, Israel circled the city in silence. Once on the first day. Once again the second. And again the third. Jericho's soldiers stood ready on the walls, confused and unnerved by this inexplicable strategy. But Rahab watched with a strange sense of calm. Each day as Israel marched past, she stood by her window. The scarlet cord fluttered in the breeze, a silent proclamation, "I belong to the Lord." On the seventh day, as the sun rose red over the horizon, Israel marched around Jericho not once but 7 times. The priests blew their trumpets, the people lifted their voices, and the walls, those massive, ancient fortifications that had stood for generations, collapsed into rubble. Dust clouded the sky, screams echoed through the city, chaos erupted everywhere. But Rahab's house stood firm, untouched amid destruction. The 2 spies rushed to her home just as they had promised, gathering her family and leading them to safety. And Rahab, once a woman known only by her past, became part of the people of God, a living testimony to the power of faith. Her name would later appear in the lineage of kings, even in the lineage of the Messiah himself, proof that God delights in redeeming those who choose him, no matter their story. As dawn broke over the eastern side of the Jordan River, a golden haze settled upon the camp of Israel, stretching as far as the eye could see. Families stirred from their tents, children rubbed sleep from their eyes, warriors tightened their belts, and priests prepared the sacred objects for the day ahead. A hushed anticipation blanketed the entire assembly, for they all knew that this was no ordinary morning. Today, after generations of wandering, waiting, and longing, Israel would take its first step toward the promised land. The Jordan River, swollen with the spring floodwaters, roared violently before them, a seemingly impassable barrier. But Joshua had spoken with unwavering confidence, telling the people that the Lord would perform wonders among them. And so, tens of thousands gathered at the riverbank, breathless with expectation, watching the priests lift the Ark of the Covenant upon their shoulders. The Ark, a gold-covered chest carrying the very presence of God, shone in the light of dawn as the priests began their slow, steady march toward the raging waters. Joshua stood nearby, observing the scene with a mixture of awe and solemn responsibility. He remembered the Red Sea, though he had been young then. He remembered the terror of the Egyptian army behind them and the impossible waters before them, and how God had made a way when no way existed. And now, Joshua trusted that the same God would do it again. He had told the people, "By this you will know that the living God is among you." As the priests approached the river, the sound of the floodwaters thundered louder. The Jordan was at its highest point of the year, overflowing its banks, crushing anything in its path. Many Israelites stared at the river with wide, uncertain eyes. Some clutched their children. Others whispered prayers under their breath. But the priests did not slow. Step by step, they trudged forward until at last their feet touched the very edge of the water. The moment their soles pressed into the water's surface, something unimaginable happened. The roaring current ceased its flow. The waters rising from upstream gathered into a towering heap far off at a city called Adam, while the waters below drained away toward the Dead Sea until the riverbed lay exposed. A collective gasp swept across the people as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. Children clung to their mothers, old men fell to their knees, and warriors stared in stunned reverence. The priests, bearing the ark, walked into the middle of the riverbed and stood firm upon the dry ground, the ark gleaming brightly beneath the sun. The presence of God stood between Israel and the waters that once threatened them. Joshua raised his hand and gave the order, "Go forward." And Israel, hundreds of thousands strong, began to cross. Mothers carried infants, fathers led their families, elders leaned on staffs, shepherds guided their flocks, and warriors marched with heads held high. They moved quickly but reverently, glancing at the ark, glancing at the miracle around them, trying to understand what their eyes beheld. The river that had roared with fury now lay silently beneath their feet, its muddy ground dried by the breath of God. Some wept openly, remembering the long years in the wilderness. Others whispered, "The Lord is faithful," over and over as they walked. Step after step, Israel crossed through the place where God displayed his power once more. Meanwhile, Joshua selected 12 men, one from each tribe, and commanded them to take 12 large stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests stood. These stones, heavy enough that each man had to hoist one upon his shoulder, would serve as a memorial for generations to come. When your children ask in the future, "What do these stones mean?" you will tell them, "The Lord cut off the waters of the Jordan before the Ark of the Covenant." These stones will be a reminder forever. The men obeyed, gathering the stones one by one and carrying them to the western bank. Their footsteps were slow but purposeful, for they knew they were participating in something eternal. As the last of the Israelites crossed the river, Joshua commanded the priests to come up out of the Jordan. Still holding the ark, they began to ascend the bank. And the moment their feet touched dry land on the western side, the waters that had stood still rushed back into place with thunderous force, returning the Jordan to its full depth. The people gasped as the river surged, roaring as though awakened from a supernatural pause. The miracle was complete. The God who had parted the Red Sea had now parted the Jordan, marking the beginning of Israel's new chapter in the land of promise. Once the people were safely gathered on the western shore, Joshua set up the 12 stones at a place called Gilgal. Standing tall in the sunlight, the stones formed a monument of memory, silent yet powerful, a testimony that would speak to every generation. Joshua addressed the people with authority. "The Lord did this so that all the peoples of the earth may know his power, and so that you may always fear and honor your God." Families listened intently, children wide-eyed, warriors nodding solemnly. They understood that this miracle was not only about crossing a river, it was about God declaring himself faithful once again. As night fell, Israel made camp at Gilgal. Fires flickered across the valley, children laughed and played, and elders told the story of the day's wonder over and over. Yet amid the celebration, there was also a deep awareness that the days ahead would require courage. Beyond the river lay fortified cities, powerful kings, and battles yet to be fought. But now Israel had crossed the Jordan not in their strength, but in God's. The living God had gone before them, stopped the waters, and prepared their way. And if he had done this, then no wall, no army, no enemy could stand against them. Joshua stood at the edge of camp that night, gazing at the Jordan reflecting the starlight. The river flowed peacefully once more, giving no sign of the miraculous moment that had taken place hours earlier. But Joshua remembered, and he knew the people would remember. The God who had brought them this far would carry them forward. The crossing of the Jordan was not only a path into a new land, it was a promise that God would walk with them into every challenge, every battle, and every victory that awaited in the promised land. In the days following the miraculous fall of Jericho, the camp of Israel pulsed with excitement and triumph. Stories of the collapsing walls spread from tent to tent, children reenacted the march with sticks as trumpets, and families lifted their voices in thanksgiving to the Lord. For the first time since crossing the Jordan, Israel felt the exhilaration of victory. They had entered the land not with human strength but with divine power. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, an unseen shadow rested over the camp, a shadow caused by a single act of disobedience that none but God knew. His anger smoldered quietly, unnoticed by the people, for while Israel rejoiced, sin had crept like a serpent into their midst. Among the soldiers who fought at Jericho was a man named Achan, of the tribe of Judah. He was not a leader or a priest, nor someone widely recognized. He was an ordinary man, yet his ordinary place did not shield him from extraordinary temptation. When Jericho fell and Israel moved through the ruins, Joshua had given a clear command from the Lord: all the silver, gold, bronze, and iron belong to the treasury of the Lord. Do not take any of it for yourselves, lest you bring destruction upon the camp. Achan had heard the command like everyone else. But as he passed through a shattered home near the city center, his eyes landed upon something that gleamed in the dust, a beautiful Babylonian robe, rich in color and embroidery, unlike anything he had ever seen. Nearby were silver coins and a bar of gold. The robe whispered wealth, the silver promised comfort, the gold promised security. Achan's heart pounded. Desire surged within him. And though he knew the command, he convinced himself that no harm could come from a single transgression. In a moment of weakness, he gathered the items, hid them beneath his cloak, and later buried them beneath his tent, covering them with earth as though the soil itself could conceal his guilt from God. Israel, unaware of this theft, prepared to move forward. The next city in their path was Ai, a much smaller and weaker stronghold than Jericho. Confident from their recent victory, the spies returned to Joshua with a bold report: do not let all the people go up. Send only 2,000 or 3,000 men. Do not weary the whole army. Joshua agreed, and about 3,000 warriors marched toward Ai. But when they attacked, the men of Ai struck them down, chasing them from the gates and killing 36 Israelites. Panic swept through the soldiers as they retreated. Their hearts melted like wax, consumed by sudden fear. How could they lose after Jericho? How could such a small city defeat them? Something was terribly wrong. When word reached Joshua, he tore his clothes in grief and fell face down before the ark of the Lord. The elders joined him, sprinkling dust upon their heads. Joshua cried out, "Alas, Lord God, why did you bring this people across the Jordan only to deliver us into the hands of our enemies? What shall I say now that Israel has fled?" His anguish poured out until evening, but the Lord interrupted him with a powerful rebuke: "Rise up. Israel has sinned. They have taken what was devoted to me. They have stolen and lied, and hidden it among their belongings. That is why you cannot stand before your enemies. God's words cut through the despair like a blade. The defeat at Ai was not due to weakness or strategy, it was because the Lord himself had withdrawn his protection. Sin had broken the covenant. It had to be removed. Joshua rose with fierce determination. The Lord instructed him to bring forth the tribes of Israel one by one, then the clans, then the families, until the guilty man was revealed. The next morning, the entire nation gathered before the Lord. A solemn silence settled over the valley as Joshua began the selection. The tribe of Judah was chosen. Then the clan of the Zerahites. Then the family of Zabdi. And finally, the lot fell upon Achan, son of Carmi. All eyes turned toward him. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and the truth lay heavy upon him. Joshua stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "My son, give glory to the Lord. Tell me what you have done." Achan's voice trembled as he confessed everything, how he had seen the robe, the silver, the gold, how he had desired them, how he had taken them, and where they were buried. Joshua sent men to his tent, and they quickly returned with the stolen items in their hands, tarnished by dirt, yet gleaming with undeniable guilt. They placed them before the Lord, a painful display of disobedience. Joshua then led Achan, along with his family and possessions, to the valley of Achor. It was not easy. The people wept. Achan wept. The weight of sin had brought ruin not only upon him but upon all who belonged to him, illustrating the terrible truth that sin never affects only the one who commits it. There, in the valley, judgment was carried out, as severe as the disobedience had been. Achan and all that belonged to him were destroyed, and Israel raised over him a great heap of stones, a memorial to remind future generations of the consequences of hidden sin. The valley was named Achor, trouble, for it marked the place where Israel's trouble began, and where it ended. When the judgment was complete, the Lord's anger turned away. His presence returned to Israel. The shadow lifted from the camp. That night, as Israel lay in quiet reflection, the people understood a sobering truth: victory does not come from numbers, strength, or strategy, but from obedience. One man's hidden sin had brought defeat upon an entire nation. And though the story of Achan was tragic, it served as a vital reminder that the covenant with God was holy. He desired purity, honesty, and wholehearted devotion. Joshua, standing near the valley's edge, looked upon the stones piled high and felt both grief and resolve. Israel would move forward again, but this time with renewed reverence. They had learned painfully that God's presence could not be presumed, it must be honored. And with the sin removed, the Lord would once again fight for his people. After the sorrowful judgment of Achan and the heavy stillness that followed, a renewed sense of purity and solemn dedication settled across the camp of Israel. The people moved more quietly, spoke with greater caution, and prayed with deeper sincerity. The valley of Achor, still bearing the fresh mound of stones marking Achan's sin, reminded the nation that obedience was not optional. Disobedience brought death, but repentance restored God's presence. Israel understood now that conquering the land required not only courage but holiness. And once the sin was removed, God once again spoke to Joshua with tender strength: "Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all the fighting men with you and go up to Ai. I have delivered the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land into your hand." The words washed over Joshua like cool water, lifting the weight from his heart and replacing it with renewed resolve. This time, the battle would be fought not in presumption but in obedience. Joshua rose early the next morning and summoned the leaders. He laid out the Lord's strategy, one far more intricate and tactical than the silent march around Jericho. Ai would not fall to a miracle of collapsing walls but through a divinely inspired ambush. Joshua selected 30,000 of his strongest warriors and sent them out by night to hide behind Ai, concealed in the darkness among rocks and hills. "Stay near the city," he instructed them. "When its people come out against us, rise quickly and take the city." The men nodded, disappearing into the shadows like wolves on the hunt. Then Joshua gathered another group, positioning them in front of Ai. This force would approach the city openly, drawing the attention of Ai's king. Joshua himself would stand with them, acting not only as leader but as bait. As dawn lit the plains, Israel moved into place. The city of Ai, perched on its hill, stirred with early morning noise. Farmers opened gates to drive out animals, soldiers stretched and strapped on their armor. No one suspected the hidden danger crouched behind them. Finally, Joshua's front division advanced toward the city. The king of Ai saw them and immediately recognized them. These were the same warriors who had fled in shame days earlier. Confidence surged through him. He sounded the alarm, and his men poured from the city gates with a triumphant roar, eager to repeat their earlier victory. Israel pretended to panic, turning and running as though in terror. Dust filled the air as the men of Ai chased after them with shouts of triumph. Every soldier in Ai abandoned the city, leaving it defenseless. Even the men of Bethel, a nearby town, joined the chase, leaving both cities unguarded. At that precise moment, the Lord spoke to Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." Joshua lifted his javelin high, the metal gleaming under the sun. It was the signal the hidden warriors had awaited. Instantly, 30,000 men sprang from their concealment and rushed through the open gates of Ai. They poured into the empty streets, seized the city, and set it ablaze. Thick smoke rose into the sky, forming a dark column visible from miles away. As the men of Ai chased Joshua's decoy force across the plain, one of the soldiers glanced back and froze. Flame shot upward. Smoke spiraled into the air. Confusion swept through their ranks like a violent wind. Their confident shouts faltered, replaced by horror. The Israelites they were pursuing suddenly stopped fleeing, turning around with fierce determination. Joshua lowered his gaze, his javelin still raised, a symbol that the Lord was fighting with them. The men of Ai halted in panic, trapped between Joshua's front force and the burning city behind them, where the ambush unit now rushed out to join the attack. Realizing they were surrounded, the warriors of Ai fought desperately, but their strength had vanished. Israel struck them down with precision and discipline. None escaped. The city's flames rose higher, crackling and roaring as the judgment of God fell upon Ai. The king of Ai was captured alive and brought before Joshua. Israel fought until no enemy remained, fulfilling the command of the Lord. The ambush was total, the victory complete. When the battle ended, Joshua lowered the javelin he had held aloft throughout the entire conflict. His arm ached, but his heart soared with gratitude. God had turned their earlier defeat into triumph, not through might alone, but through humility, correction, and obedience. The king of Ai was executed and hung on a tree until evening as a symbol of complete conquest, then taken down before nightfall as the law required. The city was burned to dust, becoming a permanent reminder of what happens when nations stand against the living God. After the victory, Joshua gathered all Israel, men, women, children, strangers living among them, priests, leaders, and warriors. They traveled north to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the mountains of blessing and curse. There, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, using uncut stones untouched by iron tools, as Moses had commanded. Sacrifices were offered. The aroma rose into the air, a fragrance of praise and restored relationship. Joshua then wrote the words of the law upon the stones so all could see. The people gathered between the two mountains, and Joshua read aloud every word of the law, every blessing, every warning, every command. No one was excluded. It was a sacred moment of recommitment, a declaration that Israel would walk in the ways of the Lord. Families stood in silence, warriors sheathed their swords, children listened with wonder. The mountains echoed with the voice of Joshua, reminding Israel that their victories came not from strength or skill, but from obedience and faithfulness. When the reading ended, the people lifted their voices in agreement. Their covenant with God was renewed once more, strong, pure, unbroken. As night fell and the fires of the altar crackled softly, Joshua looked upon the faces of Israel. He saw courage restored, purpose renewed, unity strengthened. God had given them victory at Ai, not simply to conquer a city, but to teach them that holiness mattered more than strategy, and obedience more than numbers. The sin of one man had brought defeat, but the repentance of a nation had brought victory. Israel could now move forward with confidence, for the Lord fought for them. And thus the conquest continued, not by the strength of Israel's hands, but by the faithfulness of Israel's God.